NTSC, named after the National Television System Committee, is the analog television system that was used in most of the Americas. Myanmar, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, and some Pacific Island nations and territories. Most countries using the NTSC standard, as well as those using other analog television standards, have switched to newer digital television standards, there being at least 4 different standards in use around the world. North America, parts of Central America, and South Korea are adopting the ATSC standards, while other countries are adopting or have adopted other standards. This standard is slowly being replaced by HDTV. The first NTSC standard was developed in 1941 and had no provision for color television. In 1953 a second NTSC standard was adopted, which allowed for color television broadcasting which was compatible with the existing stock of black and white receivers. NTSC was the first widely adopted broadcast color system and remained dominant until the first decade of the 21st century, when it was replaced with digital ATSC. After nearly 70 years, the majority of over-the-air NTSC transmissions in the United States ceased on June 12, 2009, and by August 31, 2011, in Canada and most other NTSC markets. Mexico completed their transition in 2012. Digital broadcasting allows higher resolution television, but digital standard definition television continues to use the frame rate and number of lines of resolution established by the analog NTSC standard. Systems using the NTSC frame and line rate are still referred to informally as NTSC. NTSC video signals are still used in video playback and in CCTV and surveillance video systems. Broadcast of analog television signals by organizations exempt from the mandated upgrade continue as of January 2014. History. The National Television System Committee was established in 1940 by the United States Federal Communications Commission to resolve the conflicts that were made between companies over the introduction of a nationwide analog television system in the United States. In March 1941, the committee issued a technical standard for black and white television that built upon a 1936 recommendation made by the Radio Manufacturers Association. Technical advancements of the vestigial sideband technique allowed for the opportunity to increase the image resolution. The NTSC selected 525 scan lines as a compromise between RCA's 441 scan line standard and Philco's and Dumont's desire to increase the number of scan lines to between 605 and 800. The standard recommended a frame rate of 30 frames per second, consisting of 2 interlaced fields per frame at 262.5 lines per field and 60 fields per second. Other standards in the final recommendation were an aspect ratio of 4:3, and frequency modulation for the sound signal. In January 1950, the committee was reconstituted to standardize color television. In December 1953, it unanimously approved what is now called the NTSC Color Television Standard. The compatible color standard retained full backward compatibility with existing black and white television sets. Color information was added to the black and white image by introducing a color subcarrier of precisely 3.579545 MHz. The precise frequency was chosen so that horizontal line rate modulation components of the chrominance signal would fall exactly in between the horizontal line rate modulation components of the luminance signal, thereby enabling the chrominance signal to be filtered out of the luminance signal with minor degradation of the luminance signal. Due to limitations of frequency divider circuits at the time the color standard was promulgated, the color subcarrier frequency was constructed as composite frequency assembled from small integers, in this case 5A, 7A, 9 over opening round bracket 8A, 11, MHz. The horizontal line rate was reduced to approximately 15,734 lines per second from 15,750 lines per second, and the frame rate was reduced to approximately 29.970 frames per second from 30 frames per second. These changes amounted to less than 0.1% and were readily tolerated by existing television receivers. The FCC had briefly approved a different color television standard, starting in October 1950, which was developed by CBS. However, this standard was incompatible with black and white broadcasts. It used a rotating color wheel, reduced the number of scan lines from 525 to 405, and increased the field rate from 60 to 144, but had an effective frame rate of only 24 frames per second. Legal action by rival RCA kept commercial use of the system off the air until June 1951, and regular broadcasts only lasted a few months before manufacture of all-color television sets was banned by the Office of Defense Mobilization in October, ostensibly due to the Korean War. CBS rescinded its system in March 1953, and the FCC replaced it on December 17, 1953, with the Ntsc color standard, which was cooperatively developed by several companies, including RCA and Philco. The first publicly announced network television broadcast of a program using the Ntsc-compatible color system was an episode of NBC's Kaikla, Fran and Ollie on August 30, 1953, although it was viewable in color only at the network's headquarters. The first nationwide view of Ntsc color came on the following January 1 with the coast-to-coast broadcast of the Tournament of Roses Parade, viewable on prototype color receivers at special presentations across the country. The first color Ntsc television camera was the RCA TK40, used for experimental broadcasts in 1953. An improved version, the TK40A, introduced in March 1954, was the first commercially available color television camera. Later that year, the improved TK41 became the standard camera used throughout much of the 1960s. The Ntsc standard has been adopted by other countries, including most of the Americas and Japan. With the advent of digital television, analog broadcasts are being phased out. Most U.S. Ntsc broadcasters were required by the FCC to shut down their analog transmitters in 2009. Low-power stations, Class A stations and translators were not immediately affected. An analog cutoff date for those stations was not set. Technical details, lines and refresh rate. Ntsc color encoding is used with the System M television signal, which consists of 29.97 interlaced frames of video per second. Each frame is composed of two fields, each consisting of 262.5 scan lines, for a total of 525 scan lines. 483 scan lines make up the visible raster. The remainder allow for vertical synchronization and retrace. This blanking interval was originally designed to simply blank the receiver's CRT to allow for the simple analog circuits and slow vertical retrace of early TV receivers. However, some of these lines may now contain other data such as closed captioning and vertical interval timecode. In the complete raster, the even-numbered scan lines are drawn in the first field, and the odd-numbered are drawn in the second field, to yield a flicker-free image at the field refresh frequency of approximately 59.94 Hz. For comparison, 576i systems such as PALBG and SECAM use 625 lines, and so have a higher vertical resolution, but a lower temporal resolution of 25 frames or 50 fields per second. The Ntsc field refresh frequency in the black and white system originally exactly matched the nominal 60 Hz frequency of alternating current power used in the United States. Matching the field refresh rate to the power source avoided intermodulation, which produces rolling bars on the screen. When color was added to the system, the refresh frequency was shifted slightly downward to 59.94 Hz to eliminate stationary dot patterns in the difference frequency between the sound and color carriers, as explained below in color encoding. Synchronization of the refresh rate to the power incidentally helped Kinetscope cameras record early live television broadcasts, as it was very simple to synchronize a film camera to capture one frame of video on each film frame by using the alternating current frequency to set the speed of the synchronous AC motor drive camera. By the time the frame rate changed to 29.97 Hz for color, it was nearly as easy to trigger the camera shutter from the video signal itself. The actual figure of 525 lines was chosen as a consequence of the limitations of the vacuum tube-based technologies of the day. In early TV systems, a master voltage-controlled oscillator was run at twice the horizontal line frequency, and this frequency was divided down by the number of lines used to give the field frequency. This frequency was then compared with the 60 Hz power line frequency and any discrepancy corrected by adjusting the frequency of the master oscillator. For interlaced scanning, an odd number of lines per frame was required in order to make the vertical retrace distance identical for the odd and even fields, which meant the master oscillator frequency had to be divided down by an odd number. At the time, the only practical method of frequency division was the use of a chain of vacuum tube multivibrators, the overall division ratio being the mathematical product of the division ratios of the chain. Since all the factors of an odd number also have to be odd numbers, it follows that all the dividers in the chain also had to divide by odd numbers, and these had to be relatively small due to the problems of thermal drift with vacuum tube devices. The closest practical sequence to 500 that meets these criteria was 3A, 5A, 5A, 7 equals 525. Colorimetry, the original 1953 color Ntsc specification, still part of the United States Code of Federal Regulations, defined the colorimetric values of the system as follows. Early color television receivers, such as the RCACT 100, were faithful to this specification, having a larger gamut than most of today's monitors. Their low-efficiency phosphors were weak and long-persistent, leaving trails after moving objects. Starting in the late 1950s, picture tube phosphors would sacrifice saturation for increased brightness. This deviation from the standard at both the receiver and broadcaster was the source of considerable color variation. SMPTEC To ensure more uniform color reproduction, receivers started to incorporate color correction circuits that converted the received signal encoded for the colorimetric values listed above via into signals encoded for the phosphors actually used within the monitor. Since such color correction cannot be performed accurately on the nonlinear gamma-corrected signals transmitted, the adjustment can only be approximated, introducing both hue and luminance errors for highly saturated colors. Similarly at the broadcaster stage, in 1968-69 the Conrac Corporation, working with SCA, defined a set of controlled phosphors for use in broadcast color picture video monitors. This specification survives today as the SMPTEC phosphor specification. As with home receivers, it was further recommended that studio monitors incorporate similar color correction circuits so that broadcasters would transmit pictures encoded for the original 1953 colorimetric values, in accordance with FCC standards. In 1987, the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers Committee on Television Technology, Working Group on Studio Monitor Colorimetry, adopted the SMPTEC phosphors for general use in recommended practice 145, prompting many manufacturers to modify their camera designs to directly encode for SMPTEC colorimetry without color correction, as approved in SMPTE Standard 170M, Composite Analog Video Signal Ntsc for studio applications. As a consequence, the ATSC digital television standard states that for 480i signals, SMPTEC colorimetry should be assumed unless colorimetric data is included in the transport stream. Japanese Ntsc never changed primaries and white point to SMPTEC, continuing to use the 1953 Ntsc primaries and white point. Both the PAL and SECAM systems used the original 1953 Ntsc colorimetry as well until 1970. Unlike Ntsc, however, the European Broadcasting Union rejected color correction in receivers and studio monitors that year and instead explicitly called for all equipment to directly encode signals for the EBU colorimetric values, further improving the color fidelity of those systems. Color encoding. For backward compatibility with black and white television, Ntsc uses a luminance-chrominance encoding system invented in 1938 by Georges Valenzi. The three-color picture signals are divided into luminance, which takes the place of the original monochrome signal, and chrominance, which carries only the color information. This process is applied to each color source by its own colorplexer, thereby allowing a compatible color source to be managed as if it was an ordinary monochrome source. This allows black and white receivers to display Ntsc color signals by simply ignoring the chrominance signal. Some black and white TVs sold in the US after the introduction of color broadcasting in 1953 were designed to filter chroma out, but the early B&W sets did not do this, and chrominance could be seen as a dot pattern in highly colored areas of the picture. In Ntsc, chrominance is encoded using two color signals known as I and Q in a process called QAM. The two signals each amplitude modulate 3.58 MHz carriers, which are 90 degrees out of phase with each other, and the result added together but with the carriers themselves being suppressed. The result can be viewed as a single sine wave with varying phase relative to a reference carrier and with varying amplitude. The varying phase represents the instantaneous color hue captured by a TV camera, and the amplitude represents the instantaneous color saturation. This 3.58 MHz subcarrier is then added to the luminance to form the composite color signal, which modulates the video signal carrier just as in monochrome transmission. For a color TV to recover hue information from the color subcarrier, it must have a zero-phase reference to replace the previously suppressed carrier. The Ntsc signal includes a short sample of this reference signal, known as the color burst, located on the back porch of each horizontal synchronization pulse. The color burst consists of a minimum of 8 cycles of the unmodulated color subcarrier. The TV receiver has a local oscillator, which is synchronized with these color bursts. Combining this reference phase signal derived from the color burst with the chrominance signal's amplitude and phase allows the recovery of the I and Q signals, which when combined with the luminance information allows the reconstruction of a color image on the screen. Color TV has been said to really be color TV because of the total separation of the brightness part of the picture from the color portion. In court televisions, the Ntsc signal is turned into 3 color signals called red, green and blue, each controlling that color electron gun. TV sets with digital circuitry use sampling techniques to process the signals, but the end result is the same. For both analog and digital sets processing an analog Ntsc signal, the original 3 color signals are transmitted using 3 discrete signals and then recovered as 3 separate colors and combined as a color image. When a transmitter broadcasts an Ntsc signal, it amplitude modulates a radio frequency carrier with the Ntsc signal just described, while it frequency modulates a carrier 4.5 MHz higher with the audio signal. If nonlinear distortion happens to the broadcast signal, the 3.579545 MHz color carrier may beat with the sound carrier to produce a dot pattern on the screen. To make the resulting pattern less noticeable, designers adjusted the original 60 Hz field rate down by a factor of 1.001, to approximately 59.94 of fields per second. This adjustment ensures that the sums and differences of the sound carrier and the color subcarrier and their multiples are not exact multiples of the frame rate, which is the necessary condition for the dots to remain stationary on the screen, making them most noticeable. The 59.94 rate is derived from the following calculations. Designers chose to make the chrominance subcarrier frequency an n+0.5 multiple of the line frequency to minimize interference between the luminance signal and the chrominance signal. They then chose to make the audio subcarrier frequency an integer multiple of the line frequency to minimize visible interference between the audio signal and the chrominance signal. The original black and white standard, with its 15,750 Hz line frequency and 4.5 MHz audio subcarrier, does not meet these requirements, so designers had either to raise the audio subcarrier frequency or lower the line frequency. Raising the audio subcarrier frequency would prevent existing receivers from properly tuning in the audio signal. Lowering the line frequency is comparatively innocuous, because the horizontal and vertical synchronization information in the Ntsc signal allows a receiver to tolerate a substantial amount of variation in the line frequency. So the engineers chose the line frequency to be changed for the color standard. In the black and white standard, the ratio of audio subcarrier frequency to line frequency is 4.5 MHz/15,750 equals 285.71. In the color standard, this becomes rounded to the integer 286, which means the color standard's line rate is 4.5 MHz/286 equals approximately 15,734 lines per second. Maintaining the same number of scan lines per field, the lower line rate must yield a lower field rate. Dividing lines per second by 262.5 lines per field gives approximately 59.94 fields per second. Transmission modulation scheme. An Ntsc television channel as transmitted occupies a total bandwidth of 6 MHz. The actual video signal, which is amplitude modulated, is transmitted between 500 kHz and 5.45 MHz above the lower bound of the channel. The video carrier is 1.25 MHz above the lower bound of the channel. Like most AM signals, the video carrier generates two sidebands, one above the carrier and one below. The sidebands are each 4.2 MHz wide. The entire upper sideband is transmitted, but only 1.25 MHz of the lower sideband, known as a vestigial sideband, is transmitted. The color subcarrier, as noted above, is 3.579545 MHz above the video carrier, and is quadrature amplitude modulated with a suppressed carrier. The audio signal is frequency modulated, like the audio signals broadcast by FM radio stations in the 88 to 108 MHz band, but with a 25 kHz maximum frequency deviation, as opposed to 75 kHz as is used on the FM band, making analog television audio signals sound softer than FM radio signals as received on a wideband receiver. The main audio carrier is 4.5 MHz above the video carrier, making it 250 kHz below the top of the channel. Sometimes a channel may contain an MTS signal, which offers more than one audio signal by adding one or two subcarriers on the audio signal, each synchronized to a multiple of the line frequency. This is normally the case when stereo audio and/or second audio programs signals are used. The same extensions are used in ATSC, where the ATSC digital carrier is broadcast at 1.31 MHz above the lower bound of the channel. Setup is a 54 MV, 7.5 IRE, voltage offset between the black and blanking levels. It is unique to Ntsc. CVBS stands for color, video, blanking, and sync. Frame rate conversion. There is a large difference in frame rate between film, which runs at 24.0 frames per second, and the Ntsc standard, which runs at approximately 29.97 frames per second. In regions that use 25 fps television and video standards, this difference can be overcome by speed up. For 30 fps standards, a process called 3-2 pull-down is used. One film frame is transmitted for 3 video fields, and the next frame is transmitted for 2 video fields. 2 film frames are thus transmitted in 5 video fields, for an average of 2.5 video fields per film frame. The average frame rate is thus 60 or 2.5 equals 24 frames per second, so the average film speed is nominally exactly what it should be. Still framing on playback can display a video frame with fields from 2 different film frames, so any difference between the frames will appear as a rapid back and forth flicker. There can also be noticeable jitter/stutter during slow camera pans. To avoid 3-2 pull-down, film shot specifically for Ntsc television is often taken at 30 frames. To show 25 fps material on Ntsc equipment, a standards conversion must take place. There are 2 ways to accomplish this: an analog technique, in which the frame rate is slowed from 25 to 23.976 frames per second for subsequent 3-2 pull-down. A digital technique, involving interpolation of the contents of adjacent frames in order to produce new intermediate frames. Unless highly sophisticated motion sensing algorithms are applied, this introduces artifacts, which modestly trained persons can spot. Film shot for Ntsc television at 24 frames per second has traditionally been accelerated by 1/24 for transmission in regions that use 25 fps television standards. This increase in picture speed has traditionally been accompanied by a similar increase in the pitch and tempo of the audio. More recently, Digital techniques have been used to avoid the pitch increase while the tempo in video is still accelerated, and to avoid acceleration altogether. Film shot for television in regions that use 25 fps television standards can be handled in either of two ways. The film can be taken at 24 frames per second. In this case, when transmitted in its native region, the film may be accelerated to 25 fps according to the analog technique described above, or kept at 24 fps by the digital technique described above. When the same film is transmitted in regions that use a nominal 30 fps television standard, there is no noticeable change in speed, tempo, and pitch. The film can be taken at 25 frames per second. In this case, when transmitted in its native region, the film is shown at its normal speed, with no alteration of the accompanying soundtrack. When the same film is shown in regions that use a 30 fps nominal television standard, the film is slowed by 4% to 24 fps, so that 3/2 pull-down can be applied. There is an accompanying change in tempo in the audio and, unless digital correction is used, a lowering of pitch by about 1 semitone. Because both film speeds have been used in 25 fps regions, viewers can face confusion about the true speed of video and audio, and the pitch of voices, sound effects, and musical performances, in television films from those regions. For example, they may wonder whether the Jeremy Brett series of Sherlock Holmes television films, made in the 1980s and early 1990s, was shot at 24 fps and then transmitted at an artificially fast speed in 25 fps regions, or whether it was shot at 25 fps and then shown at an artificially slow speed in 30 fps regions. These discrepancies exist not only in television broadcasts over the air and through cable, but also in the home video market, on both tape and disc, including Laserdisc and DVD. In digital television and video, which are replacing their analog predecessors, single standards that can accommodate a wider range of frame rates still show the limits of analog regional standards. The ATSC standard, for example, allows frame rates of 23.976, 24, 29.97, 30, 59.94, and 60 frames per second, but not 25 and 50. Modulation for analog satellite transmission. Because satellite power is severely limited, analog video transmission through satellites differs from terrestrial TV transmission. AM is a linear modulation method, so a given demodulated signal-to-noise ratio requires an equally high received RF SNR. The SNR of studio-quality video is over 50 dB, so AM would require prohibitively high powers and all large antennas. Wideband FM is used instead to trade RF bandwidth for reduced power. Increasing the channel bandwidth from 6 to 36 MHz allows a RF SNR of only 10 dB or less. The wider noise bandwidth reduces this 40 dB power saving by 36 MHz/6 MHz equals 8 dB for a substantial net reduction of 32 dB. Sound is on a fathom subcarrier as in terrestrial transmission, but frequencies above 4.5 MHz are used to reduce aural visual interference. 6.8, 5.8 and 6.2 MHz are commonly used. Stereo can be multiplex or discrete, and unrelated audio and data signals may be placed on additional subcarriers. A triangular 60 Hz energy dispersal waveform is added to the composite baseband signal before modulation. This limits the satellite downlink power spectral density in case the video signal is lost. Otherwise the satellite might transmit all of its power on a single frequency, interfering with terrestrial microwave links in the same frequency band. In half transponder mode, the frequency deviation of the composite baseband signal is reduced to 18 MHz to allow another signal in the other half of the 36 MHz transponder. This reduces the FM benefit somewhat, and the recovered SNRs are further reduced because the combined signal power must be backed off to avoid intermodulation distortion in the satellite transponder. A single FM signal is constant amplitude, so it can saturate a transponder without distortion. Field order: an Ntsc frame consists of an even field followed by an odd field. As far as the reception of an analog signal is concerned, this is purely a matter of convention and, it makes no difference. It's rather like the broken lines running down the middle of a road, it doesn't matter whether it is a line space pair or a space line pair. The effect to a driver is exactly the same. The introduction of digital television formats has changed things somewhat. Most digital TV formats, including the popular DVD format, record Ntsc originated video with the even field first in the recorded frame. However, this frame sequence has migrated through to the so-called PAL format of digital video with the result that the even field is often recorded first in the frame. This is no longer a matter of convention because a frame of digital video is a distinct entity on the recorded medium. This means that when reproducing many non-Ntsc-based digital formats it is necessary to reverse the field order, otherwise an unacceptable shuddering comb effect occurs on moving objects as they are shown ahead in one field and then jump back in the next. This has also become a hazard where non-Ntsc progressive video is transcoded to interlaced and vice versa. Systems that recover progressive frames or transcode video should ensure that the field order is obeyed, otherwise the recovered frame will consist of a field from one frame and a field from an adjacent frame, resulting in comb interlacing artifacts. This can often be observed in PC-based video playing utilities if an inappropriate choice of deinterlacing algorithm is made. Comparative quality. Reception problems can degrade an Ntsc picture by changing the phase of the color signal, so the color balance of the picture will be altered unless a compensation is made in the receiver. The vacuum tube electronics used in televisions through the 1960s led to various technical problems. Among other things, the color burst phase would often drift when channels were changed, which is why Ntsc televisions were equipped with a tint control. PAL and SECAM televisions had no need of one, and although it is still found on Ntsc TVs, color drifting generally ceased to be a problem once solid-state electronics were adopted in the 1970s. When compared to PAL in particular, Ntsc color accuracy and consistency is sometimes considered inferior, leading to video professionals and television engineers jokingly referring to Ntsc as never the same color, never twice the same color, or no true skin colors, while for the more expensive PAL system it was necessary to pay for additional luxury. PAL has also been referred to as peace at last, perfection at last, or pictures always lovely in the color war. This mostly applied to vacuum tube-based TVs, however, and later model solid-state sets using vertical interval reference signals have less of a difference in quality between Ntsc and PAL. This color phase, tint, or hue control allows for anyone skilled in the art to easily calibrate a monitor with SMPTE color bars, even with a set that has drifted in its color representation, allowing the proper colors to be displayed. Older PAL television sets did not come with a user-accessible hue control, which contributed to its reputation for reproducible colors. The use of Ntsc-coded color in S-video systems completely eliminates the phase distortions. As a consequence, the use of Ntsc color encoding gives the highest resolution picture quality of the three color systems when used with this scheme. However, it uses too much bandwidth for over-the-air transmission. The Commodore 64 home computer of the 1980s generated S-video, but only when used with specially designed monitors, as no TV at the time supported the separate chroma and luma on standard RCA jacks. In 1987, a standardized 4-pin DIN plug was introduced for S-video input with the introduction of SVHS players, which were the first device produced to use the 4-pin plugs. However, SVHS never became very popular. Video game consoles in the 1990s began offering S-video output as well. With the advent of DVD players in the 1990s, component video also began appearing. This provides separate lines for the luminance, red shift, and blue shift. Thus, component produces near RGB quality video. It also allows 480p progressive scan video due to the greater bandwidth offered. The mismatch between Ntsc's 30 frames per second and film's 24 frames is overcome by a process that capitalizes on the field rate of the interlaced Ntsc signal, thus avoiding the film playback speedup used for 576i systems at 25 frames per second at the price of some jerkiness in the video. See frame rate conversion above. Variants: Ntsc-M, unlike PAL, with its many varied underlying broadcast television systems in use throughout the world, Ntsc color encoding is invariably used with Broadcast System M, giving Ntsc-M. Ntsc-J, only Japan's variant Ntsc-J is slightly different. In Japan, black level and blanking level of the signal are identical, as they are in PAL, while in American Ntsc, black level is slightly higher than blanking level. Since the difference is quite small, a slight turn of the brightness knob is all that is required to correctly show the other variant of Ntsc on any set as it is supposed to be. Most watchers might not even notice the difference in the first place. The channel encoding on Ntsc-J differs slightly from Ntsc-M. In particular, the Japanese VHF band runs from channels 1 to 12 while the North American VHF-TV band uses channels 2 to 13 with 88-108 MHz allocated to FM radio broadcasting. Japan's UHF-TV channels are therefore numbered from 13 up and not 14 up, but otherwise uses the same UHF broadcasting frequencies as those in North America. PAL-M, the Brazilian PAL-M system, introduced in 1972, uses the same lines field as Ntsc, and almost the same broadcast bandwidth and scan frequency. Prior to the introduction of color, Brazil broadcast in standard black and white Ntsc. As a result, PAL-M signals are near identical to North American Ntsc signals, except for the encoding of the color subcarrier. As a consequence of these close specs, PAL-M will display in monochrome with sound on Ntsc sets and vice versa. PAL-M specs are: transmission band UHF-VHF, frame rate 30, lines fields 525/60, horizontal frec. 15.750 kHz, vertical frec. 60 Hz, color subcarrier 3.575611 MHz, video bandwidth 4.2 MHz, sound carrier frequency 4.5 MHz, channel bandwidth 6 MHz. Ntsc specs are: transmission band UHF-VHF, lines fields 525/60, horizontal frequency 15.734 kHz, vertical frequency 59.939 Hz, color subcarrier frequency 3.579545 MHz, video bandwidth 4.2 MHz, sound carrier frequency 4.5 MHz, PAL-N. This is used in Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay. This is very similar to PAL-M. The similarities of Ntsc-M and Ntsc-N can be seen on the ITU identification scheme table, which is reproduced here, as it is shown. Aside from the number of lines and frames per second, the systems are identical. Ntsc and PAL-N are compatible with sources such as game consoles, VHS Betamax VCRs, and DVD players. However, they are not compatible with broadband broadcasts, though some newer sets come with baseband Ntsc 3.58 support. Ntsc 4.43, in what can be considered an opposite of PAL-60. Ntsc 4.43 is a pseudo-color system that transmits Ntsc encoding with a color subcarrier of 4.43 MHz instead of 3.58 MHz. The resulting outputs is only viewable by TVs that support the resulting pseudo-system. Using a native Ntsc TV to decode the signal yields no color, while using a PAL TV to decode the system yields erratic colors. The format was used by the USAF TV based in Germany during the Cold War. It was also found as an optional output on some Laserdisc players and some game consoles sold in markets where the PAL system is used. The Ntsc 4.43 system, while not a broadcast format, appears most often as a playback function of PAL cassette format VCRs, beginning with the Sony 3/4 U-matic format and then following on to Betamax and VHS format machines. As Hollywood has the claim of providing the most cassette software for VCRs for the world's viewers, and as not all cassette releases were made available in PAL formats, a means of playing NTSC format cassettes was highly desired. Multi-standard video monitors were already in use in Europe to accommodate broadcast sources in PAL, SECAM, and NTSC video formats. The heterodyne color under process of U-matic, Betamax and VHS lent itself to minor modification of VCR players to accommodate NTSC format cassettes. The color under format of VHS uses a 629 kHz subcarrier while U-matic and Betamax use a 688 kHz subcarrier to carry an amplitude-modulated chroma signal for both NTSC and PAL formats. Since the VCR was ready to play the color portion of the NTSC recording using PAL color mode, the PAL scanner and capstan speeds had to be adjusted from PAL's 50 Hz field rate to NTSC's 59.94 Hz field rate, and faster linear tape speed. The changes to the PAL VCR are minor thanks to the existing VCR recording formats. The output of the VCR when playing an NTSC cassette in NTSC 4.43 mode is 525 lines/29.97 frames per second with PAL-compatible heterodyne color. The multi-standard receiver is already set to support the NTSC H and V frequencies. It just needs to do so while receiving PAL color. The existence of those multi-standard receivers was probably part of the drive for region coding of DVDs. As the color signals are component on disc for all display formats, almost no changes would be required for PAL DVD players to play NTSC discs as long as the display was frame rate compatible. OSKM, in January 1960 the experimental TV studio in Moscow started broadcasting using OSKM system. OSKM abbreviation means Simultaneous System with Quadrature Modulation. It used the color coding scheme that was later used in PAL, because it was based on DK monochrome standard, 625/50. The color subcarrier frequency was 4.4296875 MHz and the bandwidth of U and V signals was near 1.5 MHz. Only circa 4,000 TV sets of 4 models were produced for studying the real quality of TV reception. These TVs were not commercially available, despite being included in the goods catalog for trade network of the USSR. The broadcasting with this system lasted about 3 years and was ceased well before SECAM transmissions started in the USSR. None of the current multi-standard TV receivers can support this TV system. NTSC Movie, NTSC with a frame rate of 23.976 frames is described in the NTSC Movie standard. Canada-US Video Game Region, sometimes NTSC-US or NTSC-UC is used to describe the video gaming region of North America, as regional lockout usually restricts games released within a region to that region. Vertical interval reference. The standard NTSC video image contains some lines that are not visible. All are beyond the edge of the viewable image, but only lines 1-9 are used for the vertical sync and equalizing pulses. The remaining lines were deliberately blanked in the original NTSC specification to provide time for the electron beam in CRT-based screens to return to the top of the display. VIR, widely adopted in the 1980s, attempts to correct some of the color problems with NTSC video by adding studio-inserted reference data for luminance and chrominance levels on line 19. Suitably equipped television sets could then employ these data in order to adjust the display to a closer match of the original studio image. The actual VIR signal contains 3 sections, the first having 70% luminance and the same chrominance as the color burst signal, and the other 2 having 50% and 7.5% luminance respectively. A less used successor to VIR, GCR, also added ghost removal capabilities. The remaining vertical blanking interval lines are typically used for datacasting or ancillary data such as video editing timestamps, test data on line 17/18, and network source code on line 20 and closed captioning, XDS, and V-chip data on line 21. Early teletext applications also used vertical blanking interval lines 14/18 and 20. but teletext over Ntsc was never widely adopted by viewers. Many stations transmit TV guide on-screen data for an electronic program guide on VBI lines. The primary station in a market will broadcast 4 lines of data, and backup stations will broadcast 1 line. In most markets the PBS station is the primary host. TVGOS data can occupy any line from 10 to 25, but in practice it's limited to 11 to 18, 20 and line 22. Line 22 is only used for 2 broadcast, direct and CFPL TV. TiVo data is also transmitted on some commercials and program advertisements so customers can auto-record the program being advertised, and is also used in weekly half-hour paid programs on ION Television and the Discovery Channel which highlight TiVo promotions and advertisers. Countries and territories that once used Ntsc, see also, Broadcast Television Systems, Advanced Television Systems Committee Standards, BTSC, NTSC-J, NTSC-C, PAL, RCA, SECOM. List of common resolutions, television, list of video connectors, moving image formats, oldest television station, television channel frequencies, very high frequency, ultra high frequency, knife edge effect, channel 1, channel 37, North American broadcast television frequencies, North American cable television frequencies, Australasian TV frequencies. Broadcast safe, digital television transition in the United States, glossary of video terms, notes. References. A standard defining the Ntsc system was published by the International Telecommunication Union in 1998 under the title Recommendation ITU-ABT 470-7, Conventional Analog Television Systems. It is publicly available on the Internet at ITU-ABT 470-7 or can be purchased from the ITU. Ed Rayton. CBS Field Sequential Color System. External links, U.S. Cable Television Channel Frequencies, tvtower.com, Commercial Television Frequencies, representation of the Ntsc refresh rate on a television and on a DVD, Y59.94 versus 60 Hz.